Sorry, just making a note. Ata api, even though it is not possible. Kamam, this sex desire. Etam, as it is. Te, your. Prajatyai, for the sake of children. Karavani, let me do. Alam, without delay. Yata, as. Mam, unto me. Na, may not. Atirochanti, reproach. Muhurtam, a few seconds. Pratipalaya, wait for. Translation. Even though it is not possible to repay you, I shall satisfy your sex desire immediately for the sake of begetting children. But you must wait for only a few seconds so that others may not approach me. Responsively, please. Even though it is not possible to repay you, I shall satisfy your sex desire immediately for the sake of begetting children. But you must wait for only a few seconds so that others may not reproach me. Purport. The henpecked husband may not be able to repay his wife for all the benefits that he derives from her, but as for begetting children by fulfilling his sexual desire, it is not at all difficult for any husband unless he is thoroughly impotent. This is a very easy task for a husband under normal conditions. In spite of Kashyapa's being very eager, he requested her to wait for a few seconds so that others might not reproach him. He explains his position as follows. So this sort of story is unfolding a little bit here, and we see that Kashyapa is going along with what Diti wants. Now, as we were describing yesterday, Kashyapa has married 13 of Manu's daughters, and two notable daughters are Diti and Aditi. So Diti is the one here being described here. She is the mother of the Daityas, Daityas meaning the demons. And then we have also Aditi, who is the mother of the Adityas, Aryama, Vamana, all these different types of personalities, the Devatas. And so this also, so Kashyapa had the role of being a Prajapati. Prajapati means one of the progenitors who's charged with the duty of populating the universe. And we can understand also that he's not an ordinary personality. Okay, it may be because he's a Prajapati in that he has special prowess, but also keep in mind the types of personalities that appear as his children. They're not ordinary personalities, and it says, Yata yonim yata bijam, as the mother and father, so the child. So he was certainly a great devotee of the Lord. And therefore, as we see, like in material world, and one of the points that's being demonstrated here is out of a sense of duty to his wife, he engaged in procreation at a time that was particularly inauspicious. And it mentions here in the verse, it says muhurtam. So it's kind of interesting. Prabhupada's translating this as a few seconds, because generally muhurta refers to a specific time. Seems like a muhurta is a flexible thing, like depending on the time of year, it may be shorter or longer. But Prabhupada's he's making the point, you just wait for a little bit, and things become auspicious. Because the point is, and as Kashyapa is going to explain in subsequent verses, is this is a time in the evening when, just around the twilight time, when Lord Shiva is moving around the place. And this is considered a particularly inauspicious time to procreate. And so he's just, because he understands all the rules. It's not like he's not in knowledge. Yet, because his wife's so determined, and he feels a sense of duty to her, but also we understand because he's a Prajapati, he understands this is his duty, that he has to populate the world. That's what his service is. And so out of this duty both to his wife and to his service, he does it. But because we can see, it mentions in the 11th canto, it says, Devashi bhutaptra ninam pitrinam na kinkaro nayam rinichara sava, was it? Hang on, I've got it written down, I've forgotten the verse. I wrote it down because I knew I'd forget it. Devashi bhutaptra ninam pitrinam. So this is talking about the devas, the rishis, the other living entities, the pitri, the forefathers. Na kinkaro nayam rini cha rajan. So he's saying, my dear king, this indefiniteness. Savatmana na sharanyam gato mukundam parititakatum. That for one who's dedicated their lives to the service of Vishnu, then they have no indebtedness to any, not to the devas, the rishis, the forefathers, other living entities. There's no indebtedness there at all. There's no obligation. So this is the position of Kashyapa, because he's actually a greatly advanced devotee. He's not. He may have some. Well, it's a bit hard to say, exactly, but he may have some material desire. I don't know. He may have some type of desire, but we can see it's described in the 8th canto when Aditi was approaching him for procreation. That it describes there in 2 verses there how he was actually a very, very greatly advanced devotee, completely absorbed in the thoughts of the Lord. And when Vamanadev entered into his heart, he actually saw that. He could see the Lord directly. Now, whether he was a Nityasiddha, a pure unalloyed devotee, it doesn't really define that. But it does mention, there's 2 verses there actually where it mentions that being situated in meditational trance, Kashyapa Muni, whose vision is never mistaken, could see that a plenary portion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead had entered within him. So it's saying here, his transcendental vision, his vision is never mistaken. So he could see the truth. He can actually see the reality of what was going on in this material world. So he was this, what's the word they use? I've forgotten. There's a particular word that defines this person who can see things as they are. And then in the next verse, it's okay, it's fine. It says in the next verse, as the wind promotes friction between 2 pieces of wood and thus gives rise to fire, Kashyapa Muni, whose transcendental position was fully absorbed in the Supreme Personality of Godhead, transferred his potency into the womb of Aditi. So it's also mentioning here about his transcendental position. It's samahita mana. So sama means fully, completely. Mana, his mind is absorbed. His mind was completely absorbed in Krishna. So in such a state, we can understand this is Brahma Bhuta Prashnatma Nasochadina Kanchati Samasavesha Bhuteshu Mad Bhaktim Lavate Param. That he's in this state of Brahma Bhuta, he's completely absorbed in Krishna. So therefore, as we see also it mentions at the end of the 14th chapter of the Gita, how a person in such a condition, let me see if I can't remember the verse. That's the lovely thing of Kali Yuga. You can try to remember all these things, but you always inevitably forget. There's Manchayo Vyapacharena Bhakti Yogena Sevate Sagunan Samatityaitan Brahma Bhuyaya. So the Sagunan Samatityaitan. Because he's fully engaged in devotional service, unfailing in all circumstances. And this is what's being described here. He was fully absorbed in Krishna. So if he's fully absorbed in Krishna, to say that, because this samahita, being fully entranced upon the Supreme Personality of God. So it's fully, there's no break. What's that verse is the first canto? Or the second chapter, I think, of the first canto, where it mentions, yeah, Savai Pungsam Paro Yato Bhakta Hoituki Aprahita Atma. It says like there's no break, there's no interruption. So that's what it's describing here. This is his position. He's very, very elevated in Krishna consciousness. Yet still, we see that he's acting out of duty, or he's acting as if impelled by his wife. And it seems like, in one sense, it seems contradictory, because here we are, he's being described in the Bhagavatam later in the 8th canto. And I'm not sure the chronology of these events, because the Bhagavatam is not a chronological literature. It's just more focusing on different themes. So I'm not sure of the chronology, but it would seem that Vamanadev probably came after Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu, because they're like the Adi demons. They're like the original demons. Very, very powerful personalities, and we see that, different incarnations of the Lord came to address them. So it would seem, and I'm sure, like if we were to study various Puranas, we could get a sense of the chronology. And also we see in I think it's the 3rd chapter of the 1st canto, it talks about the sequence of various avatars there. That is chronological, what's mentioned there. But it would seem that Vamanadev probably appeared later than the appearance of those two demons. So whether Kashyapa Muni evolved spiritually, or how much he, obviously he's evolved, we're all evolving as time goes on. How much he evolved, it's unclear to me, at least. I mean, maybe you all know more about that. But it's not clear, but it's obvious that, from these statements in the 8th canto, that he's a very, very elevated soul, and he's fully absorbed in Krishna. And to be fully absorbed in Krishna means Sagunan Samitityaitan. It means there's no material taint. There's no material contamination. Otherwise, if there's material contamination, you can't be fully absorbed in Krishna. It's just that they're contradictory. These two things are contradictory. So the fact that he's fully absorbed in Krishna, as it says, Sagunan Samitityaitan, there's no influence of material nature. Brahma Bhuyaya Kalpate, that he's actually understood to be on the level of Brahman. So it seems, in one sense, it seems contradictory that here it is, that we have this great devotee, Kashyapa Muni, and his wife is pleading with him, I want to engage in sex life with you, and he gives into that. It doesn't seem a little bit contradictory. You think, because we see, I was mentioning yesterday with Haridas Thakur, there's a prostitute going there and trying to entice him to engage in sex, but he just, no, I'm not going to do that. Although he didn't say it to her, he just converted her to the stage of Krishna consciousness. But Kashyapa didn't do that. So, the Acharyas don't really comment on that. So, not that I've read anyhow, maybe there are some commentaries somewhere, but I don't see anywhere where the Acharyas are comment on that. But it seems reasonable to conclude that out of a sense of duty to his wife, because he feels, what's the word? In a marriage, in a marital relationship, because of this position of mutual service, one becomes obliged. And also, when there's a position of service, there's an exchange, and one does become obligated. Just like we see that Prabhupada often talks about how we're indebted to, and especially when he comments on this verse, the Devashi Bhutaptarinam Pitrinam verse, he comments on this verse and he says we're indebted to so many personalities. We're indebted to the sun, we're indebted to the moon, we're indebted to the demigod who's giving rain and all these different things. We're indebted to all our relatives, and we're indebted, just like here we have, in the society, you'll see that we have electricity, we have internet, we have phone, we have all these things. So there's an exchange there, so there's a sense of indebtedness. And the way we reciprocate with that indebtedness is by paying money. So you can see there's an exchange. In everything you do, there's an exchange. As soon as you take service or something from someone else, there's a sense of indebtedness there, and you have to reciprocate by giving money, for instance. But then when we're talking about service, then we see that it's a different thing. It's like the sun provides sunshine. It's not you're paying for the sunshine, but there's still that exchange is there. So there's an indebtedness. It may be karmic or whatever, but there's an exchange there. So there's a sense of indebtedness. So how do you repay that? In a traditional Vedic setting, then one would repay that by serving the demigods, the devatas, and we see that many people, not so much in this day and age, but you will see it to some extent. Many people do worship the devatas, and even you'll see in a country like Australia, there is a degree of sun worship going on, especially when the sun is shining. You go down the beach and they're all lying there just lapping up the sun. So there is that element there. There's some kind of worship going on in a limited sense. But due to they're providing some facility, therefore there's obligation, there's indebtedness, and this happens at all levels. We even see, like say for instance, we have the beautiful darshan of Radha Gopinath and Jagannath Bodhisattva and Gaunitai, and they're blessing us. So it's not just a one-way thing. They're giving us so much benediction just by their merciful darshan, by the Mahaprasadam, by the holy name, so many. So we also have an obligation. It's not you just come here and look, oh, very nice, and just go away. No, there's an obligation. You need to, in order to get the benefit, there needs to be reciprocation. There's an exchange. There needs to be the exchange. Otherwise, the relationship is not complete. In all circumstances, whenever there's an exchange between someone or another living entity or another person, whatever, there's an exchange there. So when you need to understand the relationship so you can understand what is the proper way to reciprocate. So it's the same as like we're talking about here with Radha Gopinath. They're very mercifully bestowing their glance upon us and giving us benediction in so many different ways. Just the fact that we live and breathe is a benediction from them. The fact that you can wake up in the morning and keep breathing, You wake up this morning, oh, I'm still alive, great. This is mercy of Krishna. And what should we do? We should engage in his service. As I was mentioning yesterday, this tivrena bhakti yogena, with great endeavor, with great force, engage in devotional service to Krishna. And it's the same, like we have the pujaris, so the pujaris, they're coming and they're taking care of the deities. And so it's incumbent upon the congregation then is to reciprocate with the pujaris, to give them gifts like cloth and food and what. Especially like we see this is more the case with grihastha pujaris, that you'll see traditionally that people would give them gifts so they could maintain themselves, because a brahmana does not live by with a job or anything. They live based on charity. And strictly speaking, according to scripture, if one takes a job or has a master, the Shudra, it's just like a dog has a master, but a brahmana has no master. A brahmana's master is God. So, unfortunately, in this day and age, because we don't have this concept of exchange, we don't have the understanding of relationship very much. Relationship for us is we have friends or we have a wife or whatever, that's about it. It doesn't really go much beyond that. But we'll see in the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, there's a lot of there's a deep understanding of relationships and how we need to reciprocate within relationships in order to get the benefit of the relationship. It's just like we see, Krishna describes in the Bhagavad Gita. This is a really interesting verse in the fourth chapter, verse 34, because it's talking about relationship, it's talking about exchange. It says, Tadvidi pradipatena pariprashnena sevya upadekshanti te jnana tatvinas upadekshante jnana, jnaninas tatpadashana. That, approach the spiritual master, inquire from him submissively, render service. So we see that the exchange is beginning. We're approaching him, we're inquiring from him submissively, rendering service. So when the guru becomes satisfied with the exchange that we're serving him in a particular way, we're inquiring in a particular way. If you go to the guru and you start challenging him and saying, well, what is this? What rubbish are you speaking here? Is he necessarily going to be inspired to reciprocate? Maybe not. Sometimes yes. Sometimes when the guru is challenged, then they'll defeat the person and inspire them with transcendental knowledge. We see that happens also. Sometimes Prabhupada was very forceful in his preaching. But the point that I'm making here is that we see that when the disciple approaches the guru with a proper mentality, the guru then reciprocates by giving him transcendental knowledge. This is the exchange. So service and submission, transcendental, then coming back is transcendental knowledge. So in all aspects of our life, there is a relationship at so many different levels. It's almost unlimited, and therefore there needs to be some exchange, because the relationship is about exchange. So we need to understand what is the relationship, and then we understand what is the appropriate exchange. So with the guru, because he is the superior, is service and submissive inquiry. And then the exchange that comes from the guru side is transcendental knowledge. And we see, for instance, another one that's very much misunderstood, and it might sound like a paid political announcement or something, but it's very much misunderstood, is that when for instance we have a brahmana doing a yajna for us, and a lot of endeavor goes into doing a yajna. I mean, I'm sure those of you who have set up yajnas and done yajnas know the amount of time that goes into it. But not just that, how much time it goes into learning how to do it, and understanding all the different intricacies of doing various types of ceremonies. And there's also an exchange of karma involved. Is sometimes we see the priests get karma from doing these yajnas. This is one of the reasons generally I avoid doing marriages for non-devotees, because there's a bit of karma involved in that. But usually when they're initiated devotees, then at the point of initiation, a lot of the karma is burnt up. The guru accepts the karma, and a certain amount is transferred to the Lord, etc. But there's an exchange of karma, an exchange of whatever. So the thing is like when a priest or a brahmana does a service for us, we need to reciprocate. Because what happens is like, in order for and Krishna mentions this in the 16th chapter of the Gita, that that yajna where there's no exchange of, I can't remember exactly the detail, but of wealth or grains, then that yajna is in the mode of ignorance. And the point is then, is if it's in the mode of ignorance, if there's not a proper exchange, you won't get the benefit of the relationship. So every relationship has its exchange, every relationship has its benefit. So just like, if we serve the guru properly, we get the benefit of transcendental knowledge. If we reciprocate with the Brahmins for the service they're offering us, then we get the benefit of their blessings, and then it'll become successful. If we want the activity to become successful, we need to understand what the exchange needs to be. So it's just like I'm saying, with the deities, we understand, okay, they're mercifully bestowing, the fact that Krishna has appeared in this material world is a benediction upon us, that he appears as a deity. Prabhupada would refer sometimes to the deity as the Archa Avatar, or the mercy incarnation of Krishna. So he's come in this form simply to give us the opportunity to serve him in whatever way we can. Obviously for Brahmins it means cooking for the deities, or going on the altar and serving the deities, dressing, bathing, offering bhoga, offering arti, all these different types of things. Or for the members of the congregation, it means bring presents for the deities, dance in the kirtan, things like, talk about the glories of the deities. There's so many ways you can reciprocate. And in that way you get the benefit. You'll actually, by reciprocating with Krishna, from a reciprocal, it's just like in any relationship. If there's this relationship of service, then what happens as a result is the affection increases. It's just an automatic result of exchange. So, and especially if we understand what the exchange should be. This is a really important point in all relationships, because we see in Kali Yuga, relationships are really messed up. You'll see, like, sometimes, in brother-sister relationships, in guru-disciple relationships, so many different relationships, in a brother-sister relationship, for instance, it does happen in Kali Yuga that, people, like a brother and sister might wind up having a sexual relationship with each other. Misunderstood the relationship. It's just messed up. Sometimes we see there's this idea of bestiality where people have sexual relationships with animals. I mean, that's seriously messed up. That's not that's not the relationship with an animal. And therefore, people are just like, you look at people this age, a lot of people are really screwed up. Sometimes we see with the guru-disciple relationship, sometimes you see young ladies that because they've been dissatisfied in their relationships with men in the past, and they have this adoring relationship to their guru, they almost take on this like surrogate husband kind of mood with their guru, and it's not the relationship. It's not the relationship. It's a relationship of submissive service and inquiry. And if we have that relationship, we'll get the benefit of the relationship, which is transcendental knowledge. And this transcendental knowledge, this divya gyan, will enable us to understand sambandha. And this is why it's so important to understand the relationship, because if you mess up the relationship, you'll get a messed up understanding. And you look around in this world, and you'll see people have got such a messed up understanding of what their relationships are. And therefore we see that marriages generally are a disaster. Like the way children deal with their parents, it's generally a disaster. They just, there's some of these relationships, parent-child relationships and husband-wife relationships in this age, they're so dysfunctional. They're so dysfunctional because, like the child wants to be an equal to the parent, and the parent propagates that with the child, because they wanted the same thing with their parents, but they didn't get it. Their parents were very, dominating or whatever. But the child wants to be equal with the parents and be friends with the parents, but that's not the relationship. The parent, and actually we see it mentions in the 5th canto of the Bhagavatam, Guru Nasha Sajan Sapitina Sajanani Nasha. Basically, I can't remember, I always get this verse messed up, but basically what the verse is saying is that unless you're capable of delivering your dependence from the cycle of repeated birth and death, then don't become a guru, don't become a parent, don't become a devata, don't become a king or whatever. Don't take on any of these responsibilities unless you can deliver your dependence. So we see in the relationship, there's this, and we see here with Kashyapa, he's understanding what his duty is. He's understanding what his responsibility is here. He's trying to the best of his capacity to help his wife understand, no, this is not the right time. But it's like you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. So he's trying his best to help his wife understand this is not the appropriate time, but she's just determined to pursue sense gratification, and therefore we see the result of that. So one of the things about the Vedic science is it talks about relationships, what are proper relationships, what are proper times. Everything has its appropriate time. Everything has an inappropriate time when it should be done. And we see this is talked about, in the later chapters of the Gita also. There's a lot of discussion about the 3 modes of material nature and different activities influenced by those different modes. So it's important for us to understand these details of Krishna consciousness and how, by understanding a relationship between what should be the relationship between a man and woman. We see that the deities understood that very well. She serves her husband very nicely. We see in so many of these stories with Kadama Muni and Devahuti, we see the relationship that was there, how well she served her husband, but also we see how well Kadama Muni served Devahuti, and the same here. The relationship that's going on, they understand the relationship. He's understanding, the indebtedness he has to his wife because, she's cared for the ashram so nicely, she's cared for him so nicely, etc. Therefore, he's able to engage in the practice of devotional service. So, when you think of that, how in these situations how other people facilitate our engaging in devotional service, how other people facilitate us achieving the perfection of life, then what should be our reciprocation? How should we reciprocate? This feeling of indebtedness must be there. If we don't feel indebted, then we're just a thief. We're just taking something without reciprocating. So it's very important that we understand the different relationships are there, and that's why we see in the scriptures that Srila Prabhupada has given us. Not only does he talk about Diksha Guru, because this is a problem in ISKCON. We see that a lot of emphasis is put on Diksha, but then in most cases, the Diksha comes for some time. They give initiation. You hear a class or two, and they go. And you don't see them for a few years. But the Siksha Guru, and there are many Siksha Gurus, every day, every single day of our life is giving us direction on how to practice Krishna consciousness. And this is why the relationship of Diksha, Siksha is so important. Diksha is also important, it has its place. But Diksha, Prabhupada defines as largely a formality. And he gives the example in a letter of how it's just like when you go to university, and he compares Diksha to the registration and paying the fees. You have to do that. But that's not the real exchange. That's not what you go to university for, to get registered. No, you go to university for knowledge. But so many devotees just focus on the Diksha. But this is just a small part of the process, and they're getting so much benefit from the relationship with their Sankirtan leader or their Bhakti Vriksha leader or their temple president or whatever it is, the senior devotees within the community who are regularly giving classes and giving guidance and stuff like that. But when the Guru comes, that person doesn't exist. The Siksha Guru practically doesn't exist. So it's very important to understand these relationships and to understand how much benefit we're getting from the relationship. And if we really want to maximize the benefit, which is, any intelligent person is going to want to maximize the benefit of these relationships, because these relationships are going to deliver us back to the spiritual world, then we need to understand, or we need to learn how to reciprocate with these persons in these different roles in our lives. And so, if you spend the time to analyze, you'll see that so many devotees have contributed to our spiritual growth. And if we try to cultivate a little bit of humility, we will be able to learn from so many devotees. Just like we see, I can't remember the story. Is it the Avanti Brahmana with the different gurus? Yeah, so we see, a humble person, he was able to actually take a lesson from so many different things in life. And if we can take on this type of mentality, then we'll find that everything we experience in life can serve as an impetus to impel us towards Krishna. And this is the goal. We just want to become Krishna conscious. We just want to become pure unalloyed devotees of Krishna. And if we're intelligent, if we're humble, everything we experience in life will push us in this direction. But if we take an enjoying mood, if we have this enjoying propensity, then these things are going to be anarthas and obstacles. But if we become humble and see how everything is connected to Krishna, and everything will then serve as an impetus to bring us closer to Krishna. So this is a very important part of becoming Krishna conscious, is to see that connection everything has to Krishna. And Kashyapa, he's trying to help Diti, to see, what is the right time to do things. But she's just overwhelmed by sexual desire. And therefore, we'll see in some of the coming verses, it mentions how, let me just see if I can find it. It's an interesting verse here. It's just here, this is verse 30, that she caught hold of the clothing of the great Brahmin sage, just like a shameless public prostitute. So you can see, like when the Bhagavatam is giving descriptions or like this, it's not just like some random kind of off the cuff, thing that they're saying. So to mention that she's just like, this is Gata Trapa, without shame. Like her husband's been basically preaching to her, just trying to explain to her what is the proper way to conduct herself. And yet, nonetheless, she's so overwhelmed by lusty desires. And this, we have to be careful with this, because lust can strike us at any time. And if we give in to the lust, as Krishna says, it's dushpralena and the lena cha. It's never satisfied. It burns like fire. So it's like the more you feed fire, the bigger it gets. So if we're not careful with these lusty desires, and we're all influenced by it to one degree or another. If we're not careful, then they get bigger and bigger, and they become very difficult to satisfy, and they actually get to the point where they can't be satisfied. They even have things, like you've heard of Alcoholics Anonymous and things like that. So these people are so overwhelmed by the desire for intoxication that they can't control themselves. Whenever there's the thought of a drink, some alcohol getting intoxicated, they're all about it. They even have Sexaholics Anonymous now, that people are so overwhelmed by sex, they can't control themselves. They've just got to have sex at any time. The inspiration comes and they just feel they've got to go and do it. And so we see in this age, there's so many people that are influenced by these different things because of uncontrolled desires and uncontrolled senses. But we need to, take the example that's given by great personalities like Thakur Haridas, like we see Kashyapa. He's not overwhelmed by sexual desires. It doesn't seem to be anyhow. At least the verse of the Bhagavatam, it doesn't seem to be that he's overwhelmed by sexual desires, but his wife is. And so, because he's in the association of someone who's overwhelmed by material desires, it's a difficult situation for him. But then at one point, he just sees that this is my duty. And we'll see, I think it's probably verse 31 or something like that. He mentions, verse 31 says, understanding his wife's purpose, he was obliged to perform the forbidden act. And thus, after offering obeisances unto worshipable fate, he lay with her in a secluded place. So he's such a transcendentalist that he's like, okay, my wife wants this, I have to satisfy. I tried my best to preach to her and convince her not to do it, and I'm just going to have to do it. So he offers his obeisances to his fate. He's so transcendentally absorbed that he's saying, okay, this is coming about by providence, I can't do anything about that. Okay, I offer you my obeisances, and then he goes and does it. So he's not overwhelmed by material desire. This is the point, because of his fixed state, as it mentions in the 8th canto, because he's fixed, fully absorbed in thinking of Krishna. Therefore, he's not overwhelmed by these material desires. And so even when he's engaging in a forbidden act, out of the force of circumstance, still he understands his duty. Still he maintains his focus on Krishna, and he's not overwhelmed. And so this is going to happen to us at various times as we get afflicted by desires, material desires that have the potential to take us away from Krishna, and the only shelter, the only way we can avoid that or get out of that situation is to take shelter in Krishna. And this is a very wonderful example that's being demonstrated here by Kashyapa Muni, that even though he didn't want to do that, and even though he could see, okay, this is just my fate, I have to do this, let me stay fixed in Krishna. So, it's a nice pastime. Any questions, comments at all? Yes, Prabhu. Can always count on you for a question. He's a very, very sharp mind.
I was just thinking, Prabhu, it's mentioned that he's really concerned about others reproaching him. So was he worried about his siblings or his dad and Brahma, or I don't know how, up to what part is the creation when this incident took place. So what exactly he's worried about? Who are the others?
Well, because he has the role of being a Prajapati, then he has to set the example for his siblings, for his not his siblings, his dependents, his children. So that's what I would put it down to is, and of course there's other personalities, Brahma, Shiva, all these great personalities there, the Kumaras. There's so many personalities. So he wants to act properly. He doesn't want to be condemned by history. But also I feel that because he has the role of being a Prajapati, then he sees his duty as setting an example for others. And this is the same for us. It's like in Krishna consciousness. I remember years ago, I was having a conversation with someone, and they said, "You're trying to set yourself up as an example." And they were saying this I felt in the way of criticizing. And I thought about it. I said, "Yeah, exactly. That's what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to set an example for others." Because if we look in this material world, look at the examples that the leaders and the famous people are setting. Is that an example that a cultured person a civilized person wants to follow? They're behaving just like animals, just like cats and dogs. Prabhupada would sometimes call it a polished cat and dog society. And then if you look around, you'll see that's exactly what they are doing. They're living like polished cats and dogs. They'll have sex anywhere. They'll eat any damn thing. They'll pass stool and urine anywhere. They'll lie down in the street. They'll just do anything. There's no control whatsoever. And what we see happens, I remember like in my youth, in the 60s, like I grew up in a military family, short back and sides. That was the haircut. But then in the 60s, mid-60s, along came the Beatles. And they were dressed in suits. They were all pucker dressed, but they had shoulder-length hair. And so we all started to follow that. Because they were like the most famous people in the world. And even John Lennon said that they were more popular than Jesus Christ. And at that time it was a fact. And maybe not in America, they got in a lot of trouble in America over that one, but they were so popular. Everyone in the world, practically speaking, knew who the Beatles were. So whatever they did, they had fan clubs, they had magazines, all this type of stuff. Everything they did was scrutinized. And everything they did was followed. And you look at, a few years ago, there was this, I remember, I think it was probably 2019 or 2019 I think it was, when I was in London, I noticed that all the young ladies were wearing clothes with tears in them. I thought, what are you wearing clothes out of the rag bag for? It's like, as soon as I get a tear in my dhoti, I just move it on. It becomes a rag. But they were all wearing these tears like this, like the legs and stuff. And I actually remember like when in my teens we used to do stuff like that. It was like 40, 50 years ago. But then I found out there was some kind of famous lady musician, who had been seen on one of her videos with pants like that on. And so then all the young ladies, because they're inspired by this person, they follow. So Mahaprabhu points out the most famous person is the pure devotee of Krishna. So in our practice of bhakti, we need to understand that everything we do is scrutinized. So we need to aspire, we need to strive to set the perfect example for others to follow. Whatever action the leader sets, the common man follows. And whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. So we see that, with as I mentioned, with these personalities like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or Michael Jackson or all these types of people, these big kind of famous movie stars and rock stars and politicians. Whatever standard they set, the world pursues. And that's why the world is going to the dogs. That's why the world's going to hell now, because you have all these leaders are behaving like animals. And that's why this Krishna consciousness movement is so important. That's why we have such a big responsibility, is that we have the capacity to guide people on a saintly life, on a spiritual life, on the path back to Godhead, which is their only salvation. What salvation can Scott Morrison offer, for instance? How can he save us from the cycle of birth and death? He himself is not saved. So you look at all these people we may be inspired by in this material world, and we'll see, especially when you're preaching, you'll come across. I was talking to one devotee yesterday about playing cricket, and we see that so many people are inspired by these cricket stars. But I mean, look at them. I mean, look at these people. They're quite degraded. You hear about like in the newspaper, you'll hear about their marriages and their relationships and stuff like that. They're living like animals, really. And yet we find that people, and sometimes even our devotees, are inspired by these cricket stars. But they're degraded people. So you're being inspired by degraded people. So you need to be careful, because you become your association. If you associate with degraded people, okay, you may not know them personally, but you're following their antics, you're following, with reverence what they're doing, be careful, you'll become like that. And so it's really, Kashyapa here, he's trying his best to set a good example for us to follow. But, his wife Diti, she's really affected by material desires, by lust. And we can understand, because it's a pastime that's described in the Bhagavatam, there's an element of this divine intervention there. Because it's, Kashyapa and Diti are not ordinary mortals who are just subject to the whims of, karmic reaction and stuff like that in the way we are. These are great personalities. These are the progenitors of the universe. And look at who took birth from Diti. Not just some bad guy. These are like the original demons, Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu. I mean, powerful people. Hiranyakashipu was so powerful that all the flower-bearing trees were always bearing flowers, and the fruiting trees were always fruiting out of fear of him. The Devatas were hiding. All the Devatas were hiding, except probably Shiva and Brahma, I think, were all hiding out of fear of him. It's a very, very powerful personality. When he performed his tapasya for 10,000 years, he stood on his tippy toes, and a termite hill grew up around his body and ate all the flesh off his body, the flesh and muscle, and yet he was just a skeleton there, maintaining his skeleton by his life force. He was so powerful. So, even though it seems, at least the story is explaining how she gave in to lusty desires, we can still see not an ordinary person. Not an ordinary person. And we see, as the story progresses, as soon as, that lust was satisfied, as much as lust can be satisfied, as soon as she'd engaged in having sex with her husband, and her husband said, well, this is a really bad thing we've done here, and these demons are going to come and they're going to harass the universe, she felt repentant. And she said, I don't want to dissatisfy Lord Shiva, I don't want to dissatisfy the Brahmanas. Please, pray that my children won't be, or please bless me, my children won't be destroyed by Lord Shiva or by the Brahmanas. He said, don't worry, your children will be killed by God, by Krishna. And she was happy. So you can see by this part, even though Prabhupada is giving us understanding of these things in relation to ourselves. When these things happen to us, when we become overcome by material desires, this is how we're going to respond, because we're conditioned living entities. But we need to understand the position of Kashyapa and Diti. They're not ordinary living entities. Okay, she may be overcome by lusty desires. Just like we see, slightly different category, but Arjuna was bewildered. But actually, Krishna and Arjuna are Nara Rishi. But because, Krishna wanted to deliver the Bhagavad Gita for all of us to benefit, he put Arjuna into bewilderment so that he could speak the Bhagavad Gita. But Arjuna is Krishna's eternal associate. So we see there's also an element of pastime there, that sometimes for the pastimes, different things are enacted in order to teach a story, to teach a lesson to us living entities, to deliver transcendental knowledge. The same with Pariksit. Pariksit could have counteracted the whole situation. He was a Raja Rishi. He was a great unalloyed pure devotee of Krishna. He could have counteracted the situation, but he chose not to because he understood. And we see, like so many examples of personalities throughout the Bhagavatam, that where they've been put in a situation that they could have done it differently, but accepting the will of the Lord. Kashyapa could have said, "No, I'm not going to do it." He could have easily have done that. It's not like he was overwhelmed by lusty desires, because it doesn't describe that here. But in order to satisfy his wife, in order to fulfill his duty, he did what was required. Thank you. Anything else? Prabhu?
Just regarding the verse according to Brahma, Bhakti Yoga, you saying you have to do Bhakti with full force, but many times we will overcome like complacency, laziness. So how can we overcome?
Yeah. It's just like the influence of material nature. And the tendency is there, and Prabhupada describes this how the modes of nature are constantly in flux. Sometimes goodness is dominant, sometimes passion is dominant, sometimes ignorance is dominant. And especially in living here, right? This is a very passionate location. You've got constant traffic going both ways on that corner. That's not a good corner to have that sort of activity. Yeah? So it's really going to influence you. So you really need to, as I was mentioning yesterday about this class I was listening to, Prabhupada was talking about Thakur Haridas and how he was fully engaged. There wasn't a moment where he was not engaged in Krishna service. And you look at the lives, like great devotees in our movement. I was just reflecting on one devotee yesterday, and how whenever I've seen them, they're always engaged in some kind of Krishna conscious activity. Even when they're being driven from one place to another in a car, they'll be revising slokas and things like that. It's not necessarily have to be like completely absorbed in the books, although that's very helpful. But always be engaged in some connecting yourself to Krishna always. Yeah? Always chanting my glories, endeavoring with great determination, bowing down before, what's that verse? Satam kita yantamam, yatataschajidabitamam, namashantam, nitya yukta pashate. Nitya yukta. The yukta, they're connected. Yeah. Nitya, always. And so, the thing is, like, nature will push. That's just we're in her domain. Nature will push, but we need to strive to constantly, push back against that. And the best way to do it is rather, because really you can't push back against nature because she's really powerful, and we're kind of we're atomic, we're tiny. So the best way is just to take shelter of Krishna. But there are many things you can do, and this is like one thing I bring up practically every time I come here. Is like, you look at the environment you're in, this building, you need to maintain the building, you need to keep it in a state of goodness, but it's falling apart. So you have to push back against that. You have to, by keeping everything spotlessly clean. I know some temples that you go into. Normally, like in a cultured society, you'll wash your feet before you come into the temple because you want to be clean. Some temples I've been into, you need to wash your feet after you come out of the temple, or on the altar. Some altars I go onto, your feet are black after you come off the altar because it's just not clean. And Prabhupada, if you look at his teachings, he emphasized cleanliness so much, not just in relation to deity worship, but in relation to the process of bhakti. He says in the 13th chapter of the Gita, it's not possible to make spiritual advancement unless you're clean. So this is a really important point. This is a really good place to start. If you want to push back against the material nature, if you want to overcome the influence of material nature, be clean in every single thing you do. If you look in your cupboard, what is it like? Is it just everything thrown in, the door sort of pushed shut so it all stays in there? I mean, sometimes you see that. You open the door and everything falls out on the floor because it's all just rammed in there. Is your cupboard like that? I don't know. I'm just asking a question. What about the bathroom? How clean is the bathroom? I mean, most ashrams most brahmachari ashrams, I don't like to go into the bathroom because I feel like I'm less clean after I've been in there. And it's common that the floor of the bathroom is always wet. That's not sattvic. You walk past the bathroom, you have to sort of skirt around it because the floor outside the bathroom is also wet. No, keep it clean. Keep the toilets always clean. I mean, it's so common in India. When you go to the toilet, it's like, oh my God, what a disgusting experience. But in a Vaishnava, building, it shouldn't be like that. When people come to the temple, they need to get the sense of Vaikuntha, not the sense of like this is just the same as whatever else is going on. So, if you can create a Vaikuntha atmosphere here in this building, this is going to greatly assist you in overcoming the influence of the modes of nature. Because you'll be associating more with the transcendental than you will be with the material. But in cities you have to work really hard on that because of the influence of the city. So every time I come here, I emphasize this point. You really have to be focusing on keeping this place spotlessly clean, keeping everything neat, tidy, orderly. This is really, really important. I was in the deity department this morning. I was really happy to see the jewelry is all neatly organized. You look in the cupboards, all the cloth is stacked up neatly. These things, okay, for some people it might seem it's a little bit kind of like, what do they call it, OCD, but it's not. It's just like Prabhupada talks in, there's this wonderful story of Raghava Pandit in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, how it describes how he actually had his own grove of coconuts where he grew very, very nice, tasty coconuts. Yet he didn't want to use his own coconuts because he heard these other ones from a distant place were really, really sweet, so he brought them at expense. He brought them, and the servant was washing them, and the pujari washed them and clipped them. But then as he was bringing them on the altar, he touched the door frame. And then his concern was that, he touched the door frame, that maybe dust has fallen down from above and contaminated the coconuts, so he threw them out. It's just like, when you go into pujari departments, one of the things I like to look at is up, to see, is there any dust up above things? Or in the kitchen with the extractor hood, is there any oil sort of, or ghee, like ghee residue up inside the extractor? Because what happens is when you're cooking, the heat comes up and it melts all that ghee and it starts to drip down. I've actually seen in places where it's dripping into the pots. And how can you offer that to Krishna? So it's the same as like, if you've got, say for instance, you've got dust sitting on the top of the singasan here, right? When you open the door, it moves all the air in the room. Right? And so any dust that's sitting on top of the singasan is going to fall down on the deities or on their food that's being offered to them. And it's really interesting that Prabhupada in his purport, because there's not many purports in that section,